And I'm okay. So, all right. Oh, you're already recording it, Peggy? Oh, wow.
I just started.
Hello, League members and guests. Welcome to our November public membership meeting. The meeting will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel, which you can find easily on our website. Since 1920, the League of Women Voters has been a nonpartisan, activist, grassroots organization whose leaders believe that people should play a critical role in democracy. The League was founded by Carrie Chapman Catt in 1920, just 6 months before the 19th Amendment was ratified. The League of Women Voters encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policies, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. Tonight's presentation is an example of a program with the goal of educating not only our members, but also the public on a current public policy issue. Over the last several months, after some stark examples of police misbehavior, communities across the country have been motivated to explore multiple ways to improve police-community relations, including civilian oversight. Our guest tonight will be sharing how Ann Arbor residents have tackled the issue. And just a reminder to please remember to keep yourself muted out of courtesy to our speaker. And now our board member, Marlene Kilby, will now introduce our speaker, Dr. Lisa Jackson. Marlene?
Good evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce Lisa Jackson. Dr. Jackson is a graduate of the University of Michigan, having earned a doctorate in behavioral neuroscience. She is chair of the Department of Psychology at Schoolcraft College. In addition to her professional activities, Dr. Jackson has long been civically engaged. She is currently one of 3 non-law enforcement persons appointed by Governor Gretchen Whitmer to the Michigan Commission on Law Enforcement Standards. As the title implies, this commission promotes public safety in Michigan by setting standards for selection, employment, licensing, and funding in law enforcement and criminal justice, both in the public and the private sector. Given her background in behavioral neuroscience, a special focus for Dr. Jackson is the mental health of officers and the training officers receive with regard to mental health issues in the community. Dr. Jackson is the chair of the Independent Police Oversight Commission in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She focuses on fostering a transparent, accountable, and mutually beneficial relationship between the Ann Arbor Police Department and the community. That includes reviewing complaints against police, reviewing policies such as the use of force, and making recommendations regarding training and community interactions. This evening, Dr. Jackson will talk with us about the evolution, development, and responsibilities of the Police Oversight Commission and answer your questions. You can place your questions by clicking on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and then send your question to me. I'm going to group the questions and I'll be asking them to Dr. Jackson when she finishes her talk. So it is now my great pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Lisa Jackson.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It is an honor to be here. I am always happy to talk about oversight in any form, any place, but I think it's especially apropos to talk about it with the League of Women Voters. I think about the role that women play in our elections and in our activism, and women certainly played a huge part in Ann Arbor in the activism that it took for our Oversight Commission to be formed. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit, maybe like a abbreviated background of kind of how we came to be And then I'll tell you a little bit about what we do and what might be challenging, but I'm gonna be really kind of broad with it. And then you guys should ask me whatever questions you want. And I know you have a format for doing that in the chat. I'm a college professor, so I'm used to students interrupting me all the time and saying, hey, what about this? What about that? So if it comes to that, I'm actually fine with that format as well. Our Oversight Commission belongs to an association called the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. NACOL is the acronym. And NACOL is sort of the national governing and training organization for civilian oversight across the country. And we were officially formed at the very wee hours, like 2 a.m. on March 19th in 2019. And we went to our first NACOL conference in the fall of 2019. And one of the first things that happens at that conference is the different oversight commissions from all over the country kind of stand up and tell their origin story. And so we were in the room with Baltimore Oversight, who were formed after the death of Freddie Gray. There were people from the Transit Authority in Oakland and San Francisco who were formed after the death of Oscar Grant. And so story after story, Ferguson was there because of the death of Michael Brown. And our origin story is not unlike theirs, surprisingly. So in Ann Arbor on November 9th, 2014, so almost 6 years ago, last week was the anniversary, Officers David Reed and Mark Robb were dispatched to a home, and within about 37 seconds of their arrival, David Reed shot and killed Ora Rosser, and Mark Robb shot her with his taser. There was a great deal of outcry in the community, and I think it is fair, and I think the mayor and probably the city attorney's office would agree with me that the shooting wasn't handled very well. To be fair, Ann Arbor hadn't had an officer involved shooting in about 30 years. And so they really kind of bungled the communication about that. They sort of rushed to the defense of the police officers very quickly, and that's not problematic in and of itself. But the way in which they did release information ultimately was such that there are still to this day a lot of misunderstandings about what happened, and there's a lot of resentment about the way it was handled. Very quickly, Mayor Chris Taylor said this, so Ora Rosser was an African-American woman, and very quickly Chris Taylor said this didn't have anything to do with racism, it had to do with her mental illness. And I think a lot of people would beg to differ with that. So after the shooting, students protested, residents protested. The protest was pretty broad-based. So it wasn't primarily people of color even, it was just Ann Arbor citizens outraged that something like that happened. And if you note the date, it's just about 2 months after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson. And one of the things that was so upsetting was that after his killing, several residents met with John Cito, who was the police chief at the time, who's now police chief at the University of Michigan. And they met with him and they said, we want to make sure nothing like Michael Brown happens in Ann Arbor ever. And they were assured that nothing like that could ever happen. I don't know kind of how that assurance was backed up, but about 8 weeks later, Ora Rosser was killed in a fashion that was reminiscent of that. So the community was stunned in part because nothing like that had happened in such a long time. Also, the people who had approached the police chief felt betrayed because they felt as if they had seen this coming. Then I think there were some poor communications from the city. And so people really marched and they protested and protested. Ann Arbor Civil Rights, Human Rights Commission, decided to sort of take up the cause. And there were several members who became very involved in trying to determine, should there be oversight and what would it look like? And one of them, Dwight Wilson, kind of took it upon himself to fly around the country and visit other oversight agencies and ask them how they worked and what they did and how they were formed. And then he came back, and other people had done research as well, and they decided it would be appropriate to form a task force to determine how an oversight commission might be formed and what kind of ordinance and what kind of powers it might have. Dwight Wilson then sat on that task force along with a pretty diverse group of people from Ann Arbor, young people, older people, wide variety of different professions, all civilian. And they worked for 2 years to sort of hammer out an ordinance. So at the end of 2 years, and they had public meetings and they were very contentious. Some of the members of the task force would show up at city council meetings, and those interactions were often quite contentious. And all of these interactions gained a lot of public attention. And so people like me were watching at home and attended some of those meetings. And so people were just as engaged about the shooting and potential oversight 2 years in as they were shortly after it happened. So at the end of about 2 years, the task force presented its ordinance, and they had, actually the chair of their commission was an attorney, Rich Friedman, who's at the University of Michigan, and they handed the ordinance to city council. And one interpretation of what happened is that the city council pretty much took that ordinance and put it in the trash, hastily rewrote its own ordinance, which it then passed. And then that in late 2018 started the process of applications for people to apply. So I applied, and about 63 people applied for 11 spots, one of which is reserved for a youth member. And we wrote about our interest in oversight, our interactions with police, what we thought we could bring to the table, what we thought the challenges would be. The Human Rights Commission then sorted through all the applications and kind of ranked the applicants. And then the city council had a subset of people, about 4 people, I think, who then selected whom they wanted to serve based on the Human Rights Commission's recommendation. They presented that to the council, and the council had to vote up or down on the slate of 11 candidates. And so then the formal vote to approve the 11 of us happened about 2 a.m. on March 19th. And if you know anything about Ann Arbor City Council, their meetings often go until 2 or 3 in the morning. So that might sound crazy, like it was an anomaly, but that's just a regular Monday for our city council. And so then we signed confidentiality agreements. We had an interview with the mayor who talked about kind of what we might expect. And then we formally started meeting probably in May or so of 2019. And so we had to start from scratch. There wasn't much material from the task force, any material from the task force that was available to us. And that was really challenging for a while. I think because the task force's ordinance was summarily dismissed and none of them were appointed to the Oversight Commission, although several applied, that seemed quite odd to us. Actually, one of them was. So they had one dissenter in the group, and that person was appointed to the Oversight Commission. And so it looked to the task force as if the mayor kind of had a fix in, and he handpicked people who would be, cooperative with him. That wasn't the case, but it sort of looked like that to these members of the task force. And for them, that was really discouraging because they'd worked so hard to try to get us things like subpoena power, which we don't have, to try to get us a significant budget. We got half of what they asked for. So they were very distrustful of us, but they would come to our meetings and kind of watch us. And unbeknownst to us, there's like a watchdog group that would watch us every time we met, and they would try to gauge whether we were puppets of the mayor or not. And after a while, they began to think we weren't, and they sort of reached out to us. But what happened was, in the interim, we were starting to have to do everything from scratch, and we didn't have much institutional knowledge. A lot of us did research on oversight, so we came in with some understanding of what other groups might have done around the country, and we really relied on NACOL to give us training. But we had to create things from scratch, like we had to come up with our mission and vision. Now that's obvious, we should do that from scratch, right? Because that's going to reflect the first commission. And so we thought about, so our vision talks about fostering a transparent and mutually beneficial relationship between the Ann Arbor Police Department and the community at large. And we define community as people who live and work and interact in Ann Arbor. And that was important to us because there are a number of people who work in the city who don't live in the city, because, you know, it's pretty expensive to live in the city. And so we knew that if we just focused on residents within the geographic confines of Ann Arbor, then we'd be representing a smaller subsection of people who were actually impacted by policing, right? Because lots of people come in and out and they're subject to policing. And then we thought about our mission, and that includes encouraging the Ann Arbor Police Department's respectful treatment of all community members, enhancing communication and sharing information, and promoting positive interactions, as you mentioned, and building mutual trust between the community and law enforcement. And that's certainly a tough thing, and that's a big picture item. That's a long-term goal. We can't turn that around overnight. And we think that things like transparency and accountability are going to go a long way towards developing trust. So we had to kind of come up with those things on our own. We had to come up with a process for how we're going to review complaints. We had to figure out, so the ordinance specified timetables, like the police had to give us information within 30 days of completing X, but there was no means to enforce that. So when they were late doing it, there were no consequences for being late. And so we really had to, and have to use public pressure to get a lot of the things we need to do accomplished. And so we have to kind of complain publicly, or I have to make statements publicly about, gee, this really isn't happening, and we feel like this is obstruction and we're being hindered in this way. And then city council will say, hey, start doing that. One of the things that we got when we were new was the police department would say, look, just because the city formed an oversight commission doesn't mean we have time to stop doing police work to help you out. And so one of the things we had to say is, this is part of your job to answer to us now. And we understand that, you know, that's a new thing for you, but it is part of your job. So you're not stopping doing your job to interact with us. This is part of your job. So the police certainly complained about that, and city council then approved the hiring of a person, part of whose job is to interact with us. Turns out that person doesn't interact with us very much. The person who has to do the bulk of the work with us is their professional standards person, which is kind of analogous to internal affairs elsewhere. So the liaison that they sort of paid for, who has many other jobs other than dealing with us, doesn't end up interacting with us very much, doesn't, you know, make things much faster, but it seemed like a good idea. So, we've had to struggle quite a bit, and I think that's probably typical for a new agency. I regularly talk with counterparts in other cities and states, and there are not many oversight groups in Michigan, but I regularly talk with people outside of Michigan, and those challenges are kind of common. And so we understand that we're not quite 2 years old yet, and we're probably on a good path given the time that we've been doing what we're doing, but the challenges change. I think this summer, what happened with George Floyd's murder and the widespread protest that lasted so long really encouraged everybody to shine a greater light on police oversight. And so I think one of the things we had felt was that we were kind of toiling in obscurity, which was fine with us, but we didn't feel like our city council cared too much about how effective we were. Now, our city council had had a pretty fraught relationship with the task force, and I think they were quite leery of us, and they didn't know if we were going to be political radicals or if we're going to be screaming at them all the time. And we kind of felt burdened by those expectations, like, look, we're just doing our job. But we also felt like they didn't really help us much and they didn't care. And so when George Floyd happened, then all of a sudden it seemed like our city council and mayor really cared about what we were doing. And so then we got a lot of attention, and we were like, whoa. You know, we went from 0 to 60 really fast. What does that mean? In the end, it probably turned out to be a good thing because people in Ann Arbor were very, very concerned about what we were doing. We did get quite a few calls saying we don't want what happened to George Floyd to happen in Ann Arbor. And I was like, it's already happened in Ann Arbor. You know, we exist because a woman was shot and killed by police who probably did not have to die. And, you know, that's kind of the sad truth of that. And so people had to kind of reckon with that. And we had to talk about why it wasn't really clear that happened. You know, there is a little bit of transience in Ann Arbor, but there are also people who've been here for decades. So, so we appreciated the sort of the renewed interest in what we were doing. And that kind of came at a time that the task force former members were also beginning to trust us. And so we started getting a lot more help. That's pretty useful, but we still have huge challenges sort of letting people know that we exist and that they need to complain to us. In Ann Arbor, since the existence of the police, if you have a complaint with the police, you go to the police to complain. Why is that problematic? Well, the person who takes your complaint about the police is the police. And so we've had a couple of situations where even though these officers are trained to take witness statements, they seem to be kind of reductive when they are taking complaints. And so they don't necessarily write down all the details. They don't necessarily transmit that information to the internal affairs person. The police would argue that that's fine. It doesn't really matter because internal affairs then should interview the person who's making the complaint, and they have a better ability to elicit that information to write a complete report. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't happen. But certainly the police have a different motivation in terms of their investigations. And we have not had any complaints thus far where the police have not exonerated their officers or said that the complaints themselves were unfounded. I think with the exception of 3 cases, and those were all procedural things. Kind of one of them outside our purview, it had to do with property not being properly stored. Another was when a police officer was kind of screaming at a nurse in a hospital in front of many people. And when they had a suspect who needed to be drug tested or something, and that was so clearly egregious that he went back and apologized, so they didn't discipline him. But they said he probably shouldn't have spoken that way because he was yelling by that time at doctors and nurses and really criticizing the nurse. And so it was a big public deal. So that one was sustained. But for the most part, the complaints that people make, the police don't agree with. And in no cases have they disciplined anyone because of a complaint that's been filed. You may know that, and this may be the case, I don't know what your police contract looks like, but one of the things that we need to do, whenever you want to make social change with police, you have to do that through the union. And the only time you can really do that is when the union contract is up for renewal. You know, police unions have no motivation to negotiate with us or have us be a party to their negotiations. When the task force was formed, they wrote a pretty strongly worded letter about how offended they were that the task force existed. And then when we were seated, they wrote another strongly worded letter to City Council about how disappointed they were that we existed. And they refused to acknowledge our existence, which is fine. However, one of the things we wanted was to take a look at their contract and to make some suggestions about things that would change their interactions with the public. And City Council wasn't really amenable to doing that until after George Floyd. So on June 1st, I believe the mayor called and said, hey, do you want to see the police contract? Would you like to look it over? We need it back in about 72 hours. So I'm not an attorney, but we were able to scramble and find some attorneys who would help us look at it, and we could comb through it, and even I could see some things that I thought we would change. But I also thought, gee, this is unreasonable that we get 72 hours to look over something you guys have been working on for months. And why didn't you come to us when this was first being negotiated about a year ago? So we were able to make some suggestions to City Council about things that they should ask for in the negotiation, and Council agreed to broach those things. One of the things is our police contract says that the names of officers are confidential personnel records, and no one should see the names of officers, including officers on complaints, except for the city attorney, police command, and the human resources of Ann Arbor. And that includes police oversight. They do not want us to know their names. So what happens is when I see a police complaint, it says Officer 1 and Officer 2. And I have no idea if I have 20 complaints in front of me, if this is the same officer 20 times, or if this is individual and unique officers 20 times. Is there one problem officer, or is there a systemic problem with 20 different officers? And I have no way of knowing that. So I want to see those police names. And so that's a thing we asked for, and they politely declined to do that. And the city negotiators indicate they weren't able to push for that. Okay. When police are disciplined, they get disciplined based on the last 2 years of their behaviors. And we suggested that they extend that look back period, that they should be able to be disciplined. They have progressive discipline. And so that they should be able to be disciplined based on what they did in the last 5 years. And so they extended it to 4. Okay. We also asked for, and this was our stretch goal, we asked for the elimination of arbitration for termination. And what that means is we did not want the union to be able to grieve a termination, because terminations happen so rarely, right? But they declined to negotiate on that. It's interesting, they didn't say no, so they just wanted to table it. So now they have to come back to the table and bargain on that, which is interesting. And we have lobbied to be included in those discussions because we're the only oversight professionals. So one of the things I had to do, and several of our other commissioners are working on it, is I had to go through so many hours of training with NACOL to become what's called a certified, professional of oversight. They don't want to say a certified oversight professional because the acronym means COP, and that's just the antithesis of what they do. So I'm a certified professional of oversight. We actually pay attention and study, and we have lots of readings, and we have lots of trainings on a wide variety of things, from how to look at traffic stop data, how to analyze that, what kinds of things might you want to capture, what kinds of things might you say to your city, hey, how come we're not capturing this data, how to look at arrest data, how to look at this, how to look at that, lots of stuff about unions, even things about outreach and interacting with your city council. So I finally got all that training done. It took me about a year, I think. And so I said, gee, you guys have never cared about any of these social issues. When you negotiate a police contract, you're really working on the economic issues, but we'd like to get in there and talk about some of these social issues. So we don't know if they're going to let us talk about termination. One of the things we'd like is if the police chief fires someone, that they stay fired. Police chiefs don't often fire officers. And so we feel like when they do, they should stay fired. One of the arguments is, well, what if you have a tyrannical police chief and he just fires people who don't like him? And my argument is, fire your police chief then. They serve at your pleasure. If you don't trust them, you shouldn't have them, right? So we had an instance. So we had a police, and this is all in the newspaper, so I can talk about this. There was a police officer in Florida who was working a case where a 14-year-old girl alleged that a man had sexually assaulted her repeatedly, and the police officer believed her. And so he got a search warrant. And when he searched the person's house, he found videotape evidence of him sexually assaulting her multiple times, but also other people. This was a really bad guy. And so they prosecuted the case, and it appeared that he was going to be sentenced for life. But on the sentencing day, the defense attorney said, hey, looks like something on this search warrant data was faked, and therefore this conviction has to be set aside and this guy's got to be let go. And that's exactly what happened. And the judge said that had the police officer still been in Florida, he would have arrested him, but that guy had left Florida and he was now on the Ann Arbor Police Department. And so this pedophile is walking free in Florida in the same neighborhood where this little girl lives, because this guy cut corners and faked some information on the search warrant because he was sure he was guilty, and he was guilty, and he felt fine doing that, even though it was possible that he would be discovered and the case would be thrown out, which is what happened. That's pretty egregious. When the Ann Arbor Police Officers Association was confronted with this and they intended to fire this officer from Ann Arbor, they said, no, don't fire him. That happened in Florida, not in Michigan. And so that's what we're dealing with our police union. He was ultimately fired because the Washtenaw County prosecutor said we could never use his sworn testimony. It is clear that he has lied under oath before, and thus he has to be let go. And so then he was let go. We have had a separate case where the current police chief we have has fired an officer, and he went to arbitration and got his job back. So this officer now walks around with a pretty good sense of immunity, knowing what are you going to do to me if I don't do what I'm told, if I behave in a way that I'm not supposed to behave, then what are you going to do? Fire me? It didn't work last time. That also then has a chilling effect on our police chief, who is pretty unwilling to fire anybody else lest they get their jobs back from arbitration, right? So this sort of arbitration for termination is a problem. It's a problem that many police departments or oversight people or communities have. Across the country, we see this. And so the challenges that we're working on right now are trying to make those police officers' names visible to us and visible to the public. We looked at a case in East Lansing where the ACLU sued the East Lansing Police Department. A person filed a grievance against a police officer and then said, I wonder how many other people he's also treated in this way. And he was not allowed to see the records. So the ACLU took up his case, sued the East Lansing Police Department, who settled the case by saying, okay, all police complaints are open to the public. That doesn't change the law in Michigan, though, just for the East Lansing police. There's a school board case that was settled by the Michigan Supreme Court, though, that might suggest that city officials' personnel records could be made public if it is in the best interest of the city. So we are now testing that case. So I have FOIA'd some records, and we'll see if they show me the police officer names. If they don't, then I'll have to go back to the city and say, okay, what are we going to do? They've declined this, and so we're going to have to test this Supreme Court case. So we're sort of still in our infancy in terms of trying to get information from the police department in a timely fashion and trying to get information that's useful. One of the things we found sadly amusing was that when the police close a case, they send a letter to the complainant and they say, you know, you have a complaint against Officer Jones and Officer Smith, and they've been exonerated. So they're willing to tell the names of police officers to the public. They're just not willing to tell them to us. And so we have complainants who then say, hey, I got this letter, and they're kind of the language in the letter seemed as if they mentioned us, it seemed as if we agreed with their findings. And so they contacted us. They were like, hey, how'd you agree with this? And we were like, we didn't agree with anything. We're just now getting your case to review. They were like, well, we have this letter. And the person sent us the letter, and we're like looking at the officers' names. And we're just like, what? Because when we get information, it's all redacted. So, so we still have some challenges ahead of us. I think it's typical for being new, but those are kinds of the struggles we have. We got formed because a lot of people really cared and really pushed our city council and really made it clear that they wanted some oversight. And then they found us, and it turns out that we are very interested in maintaining our independence and getting trained and being competent and setting up systems. So I have two jobs right now. One is to handle police complaints, but the other one is trying to set up systems that will last for the next 10, 20, 30 years so that commissioners who come behind me will be able to do this seamlessly and easily because we've set up some systems for complaints and communication that will stand the test of time. And that's a function of us being new. We don't have those things in place. And so I have to do that at the same time that we have to look at body cam footage and, you know, query the deputy chiefs about what happened and listen to 911 calls and things like that. So it's a little tough right now, but we know that that's just because we're new, and we expect, you know, in the next couple of years, those things will get a lot more easy, and we'll have other challenges, I'm sure, things we don't even haven't thought of yet, but you know, then we're hoping that at least some of our processes will be kind of set in stone. And so we're actually going back to kind of revise our ordinance a bit to make it more clear, because there were some things in there that I think weren't anticipated. And so there's a lot of gray areas about what we can and can't do and what the police have to do and what the consequences are for when they don't live up to their end of the bargain. So that's us in a nutshell. Are there questions I can answer, or?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Have you spoke to the police union direct?
No, they will not meet with us.
Okay, because one of the big questions I would like to ask a union is, why don't they protect the good officers and keep the bad officers away so that they're not tarnishing the police department?
You know, I think it's the New Yorker. I'm gonna look right now. There is a fascinating article. I'm gonna copy the link and put in the chat, and I don't know if Peggy, you can send it to everybody, but
You're muted. You're
I'm
muted.
so sorry. I did
Oh.
not know that. I just put a link in the chat for Peggy, and maybe she can share it with everyone. There's a really interesting article about police unions. They're talking about New York primarily, but what they're saying applies in Ann Arbor too. And I think a lot of people don't understand how police unions are different from other unions. So I'm a proud union member. I belong to the MEA and the NEA, Michigan Education Association, National Education Association. I pay dues. Happy to be a union member. Happy to bargain as a group. Police unions, though, are more like a fraternity. And so they don't have the stance that we've got to look after our image, and thus we want to make sure we only have good police officers. The more criticism they get, the more they tighten their ranks, and the more they feel like it's us against the world, and everyone hates us, and we are all we have. And so when there are accusations of bad police officers, they don't say we should help in this process. They say we should double down and protect them. So the day after the George Floyd video aired and the 4 police officers were identified, their police union chief was negotiating to get their jobs back. So just as the police union in Ann Arbor was fighting for the job of a person who had lied under oath and faked data that resulted in a pedophile walking free, you know, they're not interested in trying to root out bad police officers. They're interested in protecting all police officers, because if they don't protect one, then their membership is going, what are we paying dues for? So they're different, I think, than other unions. I've actually participated in some talks with some other kinds of union people, and they talk about the struggle of other unions and sort of including police unions in that group, because they function very differently from most other labor unions.
Right. Lisa, we do have some questions, and I would invite everyone to write their questions in the chat box. You mentioned that the ordinance that established your commission was approved by City Council after some intervention from the Human Rights Commission. Is the Human Rights Commission a part of the charter of Ann Arbor?
I don't know that. I can Google.
Well, we can Google too. So
Okay.
Let me just ask you another question. What is your budget?
I think our budget is about $150,000 a year, but about $80,000 of that is taken up paying for an administrator who works for the city, whose job is to assist us. Now, right now, and ever since our inception, that person has also worked for the Human Rights Commission. So we're fighting with the city. We feel like we should not pay 100% of that salary, that the city needs to pay the other half of it, because we could use that money and we are not getting 100% of that person's time. Now, our administrator is fantastic, and she is absolutely amazing. So, and probably what will happen is, and I think we're almost there now, we have so much going on now that we probably need her 100% of her time, and the city needs to find somebody else to be the liaison to the Human Rights Commission. Every commission has a liaison. We're the only one who pays for ours. So.
Okay. And then the city of Westbourne has a police dashboard. Are you familiar with it?
I'm not, but Wayne County Sheriff's Department has one, and I'm familiar with Washtenaw County Sheriff's Department, sorry, has one, and I'm familiar with theirs, and we are getting one as well.
Okay, that is our question. What do you have now, and what have you asked for, and what do you expect to get in terms of transparent information?
I don't know where we're gonna get. So one of the things, I make this joke, but it's not really a joke. So traffic stop data is pretty well documented just because of the way it's taken in. It's sort of taken in a digital format, and thus it's retained that way. But other kinds of data are not. So I always joke that if you wanted to know how much violent crime we had or how many calls for service there were to each ward in Ann Arbor, you'd have to dig around through legal pads in people's drawers, but it's really about that bad. The city just hired for the very first time a data analyst for the police department, and that person is going to somehow have to cull through all that data and organize it and make sense of it before they even know what they have, let alone putting it on a dashboard.
That's pretty amazing for a high-tech community like Ann Arbor.
I think Ann Arbor would be happy that you're surprised, but I'm gonna suggest that actually a lot of the city of Ann Arbor works like that. And there's some studies actually. It's really interesting if you look at there were a couple of France and another country, an Eastern European country, have to return citizens to each other from time to time. And it's fraught with tension because France is digital and this other country is on paper. And I was reading a journal article about this, but there's a reason why they're on paper. Makes it a lot harder to search for information, a lot harder to calculate, tabulate, analyze, right? And so I don't know, I'm not gonna say that the Ann Arbor Police Department is deliberately, sort of being opaque, but it certainly suits their purposes that nobody could analyze what's going on because it's all on a legal pad somewhere or 50 legal pads somewhere.
Does your website have a complaint form for citizens? And if so, how are you publicizing that?
So it's on the website. You can click the complaint form and it says, how do I file a complaint? It actually has the complaint form on there so you can fill it out online, and you can just click submit and it goes in. We also have a Twitter account, and we are A2IPOC on Twitter. And so on Twitter, we have like a tiny link, a bit link. You can click to file a complaint on our email signature. So if you ever emailed me and I emailed you back, you can see at the bottom, click here to file a complaint. We are beginning to ramp up our outreach. I think we were really thinking about it on a smaller scale, but now we have a dedicated outreach committee and they have had some brilliant ideas about how to get information out, such as public transportation. We've had some suggestions that we need to make sure that we're in parole offices and things like that. But actually most people who complain to us are not people who have criminal records. They're regular citizens who've had some problem interactions with the police. And so our challenge has been, how do we let people know who we are, that we're here? Because almost everyone with whom we come in contact, even complainants, say we had no idea we could complain to you because we're just not that old yet. And for years, you just complain to the police. We're trying to figure out, and I think we're going to push city council to require, and it's really tricky, right? Because it could go very badly, but to require giving information to complainants, either physically handing them our form or when they complain on the phone, them literally having to tell them we exist. And how would you enforce that? How would you track that? These are the questions we have. For several reasons. One, we're having a dispute over when people make a complaint to the police, should the complainant's name and address be hidden from us? Should that be redacted? Is there some expectation of privacy? They've complained to the police, but maybe they don't want the Oversight Commission to know their name. Well, nobody had an Oversight Commission before. And so kind of what you're saying is this information can exist in one part of the city in terms of the police, but not in our commission have access to it. So we're arguing about that. But I think another thing to do is to have a box on every complaint form at the police department that says, we explicitly do not want the Oversight Commission to have my information. Check that box. We've got to trust that the police don't misrepresent what we do, et cetera, et cetera. So that could be pretty challenging. We've got to make sure that the complainant checks the box and not the police check the box after the complaint is gone. So there's a lot of things that are tricky about that. We're also thinking of making sure that the police, when they I have given our city administrator some specific wording to include in the police letters so that when they respond to a complaint, they have very clear information about who we are and what we do and have to include that in every letter. I think that's a change that they're going to make actually that's a change that our city administrator has the power to make the police do without city council. So that may be helpful, but it's a big challenge.
Okay.
So you asked about publicizing it. That's one of the hardest things we do.
This is in a different direction, but is there an overlap between your responsibilities and those of the Human Relations Commission?
Not really. They look at civil rights infractions. There's a tiny bit of overlap. We're thinking about the idea of trespass, and is trespass used? Is it weaponized against poor people? Is it weaponized against young people? Is it weaponized against people of color? In that, the police are usually called for trespass. That's a little bit of overlap with a civil rights issue and a police issue. The police chief has also indicated that our trespass laws are a little bit opaque. It's not clear. It's hard for them to know when they should use trespass and when they shouldn't. And so we've been working with the Human Rights Commission to kind of hammer out a more streamlined, clear-cut trespass policy. But we have to work with a lot of community partners like the library, who use trespass quite a bit, and other agencies that use trespass to make sure that we're not curtailing the ways in which they need it to work for them. So there's not a lot of overlap, but there was actually this thing called the Crew Report that analyzed, it looked at disparities in arrests, disparities in charges in Ann Arbor, and sentencing in Ann Arbor. I don't know if you guys saw that. And so it indicates that there's a problem at the level of the police, the level of the prosecutor's office, and the level of the judicial system in the county in Ann Arbor. And I was made aware of the report just before it was published, and this Human Rights Commission was as well. Actually, we shared it with them. And so they're kind of taking it up and thinking about the civil rights implications of that. And we're having conversations with them regularly about that as well.
And who authorized that, and how did they get their data?
They indicate that they got their data from Washtenaw County websites. They are called the Citizens for Racial Equality. I'm gonna also attempt to paste the link in the chat. I can only see, I can see Marlene in the chat and Peggy in the chat. So I'm gonna paste the link to the Crew Report as well. I actually, oh wait, hold on. Got it. So there, I hit everyone. Okay. I am a researcher, and so I cannot help but question the data. I want to know what things were excluded, what things were included. I think they made some assumptions that some of these samples were independent where they weren't. Like, for example, assignments of cases to judges in Ann Arbor is not random. And I think they made the assumption in their analysis that it was. There's also a repeated measures effect. Like once you see one judge for one thing, if you ever come back to the court system, you see that same judge again. So some judges are going to have more of some kinds of cases than others are. I don't think it negates the fact that there are some problems, right? There are some disparity problems, with Ann Arbor at each of those three levels. So.
Okay. Well, we have a question about the commission's oversight of police, whether that includes resource officers or police officers working in schools.
We don't have that in Ann Arbor.
Oh, you don't have any resource officers or police in schools?
They took them out some time ago.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Some people are really happy about that. Some people are not as happy. But Ann Arbor was pretty, it happened before 2019.
Okay. So I'm looking for other questions.
I feel like I saw one in there about how many other oversight commissions there were in Michigan.
Right, that is the next one. Go ahead and answer that one.
So Detroit, certainly in Wayne County, Detroit has one of the oldest. It's certainly the oldest in Michigan, but one of the oldest in the country. I think Wisconsin, well, I think one in Wisconsin is maybe the oldest, or Minneapolis, one of them. But anyway, so Detroit has one. They're the oldest, they're the largest. They operate very, very differently from the way we do. Grand Rapids has a form of oversight. Flint is trying to organize. I think Muskegon may have oversight. I believe East Lansing is trying to organize oversight. So there are not very many oversight agencies in the state of Michigan, but there are many municipalities who have been looking at it and working towards it for some time.
Okay. Have you had assistance from the state in any way?
No, not, well, maybe. So our state senator, Jeff Irwin, has been pretty supportive of what we do, but hasn't provided any material support. There actually isn't anything we've asked him to help us do. But I think we are going to ask for some help in the very near future, with maybe thinking about how police personnel information is private. Dana Nessel this summer issued a statement about some police reform goals that she has, and making that information transparent is part of one of those goals. The state of New York legislators recently this summer, after George Floyd, voted to make all police information publicly available, not their names and not their addresses or anything like that, but police disciplinary records, work records, things like that are all public now. They weren't classified, but they're now wide open. Other states have done it through other means, and I think that is probably a goal that we could have in Michigan. Because I am sitting on MCOLS, which is the body that oversees all the licensing of all police officers in the state of Michigan and the training requirements for all departments in the state of Michigan. The thing about MCOLS is it doesn't have much money, and that means it doesn't have much teeth. It cannot require, for example, that any department do training, a specific training, unless MCOLS pays for it. And because MCOLS has barely any funding, it can't then mandate any training for anyone anywhere. What it can do is mandate the training that officers go through in an academy. And so there's a huge book, it's Michigan Criminal Law and Procedure book. And this is what people have to study when they're going through a police academy. And so MCOLS has jurisdiction over that. But it can, for example, say that everyone must have training on dealing with individuals on the autism spectrum. It doesn't mandate, for example, that there be a policy on how to deal with transgender citizens. And so there are a lot of things that probably all police departments should have to do, but they're not required to do it because there isn't any money or funding or teeth to make that happen. Ann Arbor actually has a lot more training money than a lot of other departments, and we sort of complain about how much training they don't get. And so in the time of defund the police, I'm often saying actually they need more money, because as long as we're going to have police, they need to be trained police, and we need to give them some more money so that they can do autism training more than once every other year. That's not appropriate.
You know what, Lisa, in looking at that Westland dashboard, I noticed that their ethnic and racial situation training number of hours equaled their training for dealing with the hearing impaired and deaf, which I thought was really,
I don't know how much training that is. If it's a lot, that's great. If it's only a little, then
it's like 69 hours for both, I think.
Yeah.
It could have been 79.
Well, yeah, I can 79 hours a year. That's amazing.
No, it didn't say what period of time that.
Oh, it's like 79 hours in 79 years. That's no good.
Right. But I thought the scope of the problem is a little different. I mean, the population that you stopped, for example, and a citation for ethnic and racial is going to be quite a bit larger than the deaf and hearing impaired.
Yeah, but I'm greedy. I want it all. Like, I want them to be properly trained. If you stop a deaf individual and like, there was a man who was shot because he was signing at the police officers. And the police officer said, oh, I thought he was making gang signs at me, so I shot and killed him. That's intolerable. It's intolerable if it's one person, right? It's just intolerable. If you have a person on the autism spectrum and they have a sensory issue and you touch them and they react differently because of that, and then you feel like that is resisting and obstructing, and then you further manhandle them or, God forbid, shoot them, that's intolerable. Like, we saw a caregiver shot, you guys probably saw this in Florida, where he was trying to get the police to not shoot his client who had wandered away from a group home, and the caregiver ended up getting shot. He didn't die, but he's the one who got shot trying to tell the police he's on the autism spectrum. He's on the autism spectrum. Please don't shoot him. He doesn't, he's not hearing you the way you think he is. He's not disobeying you. He's not defying you. It's just, so I want all of that. I want police to behave appropriately in all those situations, or at least be aware. Some people may need to sign. Some people may be on the autism spectrum. Heaven help us. Some people may be having a break, a psychotic break. And when you're telling them to do something, they're not hearing you, because when you're having a break, the words that are coming out of somebody else's mouth are interpreted by you completely differently. They're not resisting and obstructing. They are not processing what you're saying. And you've got to allow for that possibility.
You know what you're saying fits right into the next question, which is about whether or not, is about the general issue of diverting funds in a police budget to hire people with a different skill set than police officers usually have. And whether or not that is anything that your commission has considered.
Absolutely. Something we think about. So that's one definition of defund the police, is to take resources from them and put them somewhere else, right? Another definition is just get rid of all police. So I understand that term is really fraught and it's politically upsetting to people, but one definition of that is exactly what you suggested: take money from them and put it somewhere else. In Ann Arbor, I think we could take the entire police budget and sink it into community mental health, and it wouldn't be enough, because our community mental health system has been gutted for so long. For us, I don't know if that's pragmatic to do that. Could we take some money and use it in some other way? Sure, absolutely. Could the police department hire other kinds of people? They actually don't want to do that. So the police leadership has been clear. They don't want to hire social workers because they don't supervise social workers. Social workers have a completely different standard of ethics and manner of working, and they're not qualified to supervise them. But we look at models from across the country, and there were several cities that have teams of people that go out in the community and interact with them. Sometimes these people are not armed. Sometimes these people are really in the community a lot. And so they get to know the members of the community in which they work. And there are teams of mental health professionals, like a social worker and a police officer who's unarmed, and they go out together in teams to the same areas all the time. And they get to know the people in that area, and they help the people in that area. Is that a thing we could do in Ann Arbor? Probably. Cities like Baltimore and Chicago and I believe Brooklyn, New York, and some other places have used people called violence interrupters. And these people are often people on parole from prison who get specialized training to interrupt violent events before they happen, because they are uniquely positioned to recognize things like tensions between groups. And they are not afraid of these groups because they perhaps once belonged in these groups, and they reduce crime in several areas. That might not be such a situation for Ann Arbor, but it's probably something Washtenaw County could use. And so there are a lot of different models of policing differently than what we do. And we have community partners who ask, why the police have to show up in SWAT gear. Why do 3 police cars have to be deployed when you have a person who's suicidal, who's barricaded him or herself in the house, and someone calls for help because they don't know whom else to call? Could we have another phone number like 711 or something? If you're having a mental health crisis, or you see someone who is, or having a drug overdose, could you call that number instead of police? Because in the city of Ann Arbor, if there's somebody having a drug overdose and you call 911, the police are going to arrive first, and they're going to be with that person in that mental health crisis, whatever it is, until community mental health comes, which is often 30, 45 minutes later. So that person who's in distress is in the presence of or under the control of police for that time period, which usually exacerbates and escalates their situation. Probably not the best fit, but police are the only ones who are available 24/7, 365 by calling 911. Could we find some alternatives to that? And so I think there are a lot of things we're thinking about. I think money is a huge constraint. Obviously, everybody's city budgets are crushed right now because of COVID and the impacts on the economy. But I think we're trying to think about what kinds of solutions could we use. Can we train our 911 dispatchers? We use the county, so we use Washtenaw County's 911 center. But could we train dispatchers to ask different kinds of information when calls come in, to perhaps dispatch different kinds of people? You know, we had a situation in Whitmore Lake where parents called police because their son had a knife and they were afraid that he would hurt himself. And the police asked him to drop the knife several times, and he didn't. They shot and killed him. That's a nightmare. Those parents, of course, are mourning the loss of their son, but they feel betrayed, right? They asked for help and they did not get the help that they asked for. And so they feel as if they would have been better off not calling the police, right? And I don't think that's what any of us want. I've had students who have been suicidal and their roommates haven't known what else to do, and they've called the police. And both of the students in my cases survived, but they had horrific interactions with the police when they were at a very low point in their lives. And, you know, it wasn't a good use of taxpayer money. And so I think we're just thinking about how to do that better. And so your question about having other kinds of people in the police department or diverting funds to them is something we really do think about a lot.
Well, in my reading, one of the cities that seems to have made a lot of progress in that way is Newark, New Jersey. So. Okay. No, I was thinking about Camden, sorry. I don't think I'm as familiar with Newark's stuff. Camden's I know because they just started from scratch. Right, their police department was abolished. So the final question that I have here is about accreditation. Police talk about the accreditation of their department. What's involved in that? So there's one association, I don't know if you mean CALEA, but that's who sort of Ann Arbor talks about all the time, being CALEA certified, and they feel like it's like the gold standard in public safety. And it's interesting, CALEA has a bunch of standards, and you have to sort of say that you're using those standards in that way. And that's pretty much what certification is. There's a lot of paperwork involved, and there's some fees involved in saying you have this particular certification. Now, does that change the quality of your police department? I'm not convinced right now. For example, we think about de-escalation, and CALEA has a use of force protocol, and it doesn't include clear de-escalation at every step. So for us to say, hey, City Council, we really want you to require the police to use clear de-escalation at every step. Before they escalate to the next level of force use, they have to prove that they use de-escalation, and they cannot move to the next level of force until it's clear that they have done so. That would be way better than CALEA, and that's free. And so I'm kind of on the fence. We have a person in Ann Arbor whose job is primarily to do CALEA certification stuff. It's so much paperwork. So I'm not sure about that kind of certification. All police departments are certified by MCOLs to operate that way, and all police officers are licensed that way. So one of the jobs I have on MCOLs is to vote on whether or not a person's
police license is taken away. It is not exactly as challenging as it sounds, because police officers' licenses only get taken away after there's been some sort of court intervention or some clear violation of the rules that is unequivocal. And so our final taking away of somebody's license only happens after they've been to court and been found guilty of X, Y, and Z. So, so I'm really on the fence about certification and what it actually means for policing in communities. And I'm actually not sure what it means.
Okay, well, thank you. It's been really wonderful to hear about
Arlene,
what you've done.
it's Peggy. Sorry for interrupting. There were 2 more questions in the chat. Do we still have time for
Okay,
them?
I was just trying to be mindful.
I can go ahead and read them.
Oh, go ahead, please. I don't see them.
Dr. Jackson, they were asking, do the Ann Arbor police have body cameras? And if
Yes.
so, do you have access to that footage?
Yes and yes. So we recently switched to Axon, which was better than the body cams we were using. They really were terrible at night, and these are better. And I am in the process of trying to clarify our body worn camera policy, because it needs to be a lot more explicit than what it is. And policies of the police department can change on the dime, and they don't really have to tell us or anyone that they've changed them. So we were told that the policy for body cam usage is that a body camera, the audio comes on about, sort of comes on about 10 seconds after the video. It's like a really weird process. Once you turn it on, it can give you about 10 seconds of video from before it was turned on, and audio. But those things have to be engaged on a dispatched call, and they have to be engaged when any officer is engaged in any kind of official business with a person. So if they're in line at Starbucks waiting on coffee, they don't have to have their body cams on. But if they are asking you in Starbucks about, have you seen this particular person, they do have to have their body cams on. And we want to be very explicit about how that's used, because we have a case where the questionable behavior of a police officer is not on the footage. And it appears that it is not, I'm sorry, it's clear that the body cam was not turned on until after the police officer is alleged to have said the egregious thing. And that's very concerning for us. So yes, we do have body cams. We have good ones. They're expensive. And we do have the ability to request to see body cam footage of any officer at any time.
Okay. And the other question by the same person, but before I answer that, I do want to say, my license is public knowledge. And if there's any complaints against my license at all, it's public knowledge. You could access that information, just FYI. So the other question was, did you have a coalition with other organizations, or do you have a coalition?
Sort of. Like, we work with other organizations. We rely on them for advice and support and information and collaboration and cooperation. So for example, we have Avalon Housing in Ann Arbor, and they do a lot of housing of people who are unstably housed. They do families as well as individuals, and they have lots of housing in Ann Arbor. And they had for a long time a standing meeting with the police department to kind of talk about the challenges that their residents were facing. And now we have regular meetings with them as well. We interact with the Human Rights Commission on a pretty regular basis, but we actually go out into the community and try to partner with anybody who will talk to us ever about what their constituents are going through and what kinds of things they want to see from the police, because our police chief is new and he got hired after we were formed, and we were part of the hiring process, which is considered good and bad. Right. So some people advise that it's good for the Oversight Commission to participate in that hiring. Others suggest that you shouldn't, because you might be overly invested in their success, and that's and kind of biased, which is definitely a point. But that person we participated in their hiring process. And one of the things he wants to do is community policing, which is another one of those terms that could mean anything. Right. And so part of what he wants is for officers to be out of their cars and interacting in the community when they're not on a call, walking around. Police Officers Union does not like that. And so only in this new contract is he able to reassign people for them to go where he wants, when he wants them to go there, which is probably a good thing that your police chief can do. But we want to interact with the community because community policing should reflect the expectations of your specific community. And what does this community expect? What does this community want? What kinds of behaviors does this community think are appropriate? And so we are talking to churches and synagogues and temples. We talk to school principals and school board members, and we talk to anybody to try to get input about what they expect from the police, what kinds of challenge they have, so that what are the things that we can be thinking about as we think about how community policing should look. So in the intro, you mentioned that I have particular interest in mental health issues, and I do. For example, we know that sleep-deprived police are much more likely to rely on their implicit bias than police who are well-rested. That's probably no surprise. Your cognition is better when you're well-rested, right? We know that more police officers are killed by suicide every year than they are killed by criminals. By far, suicide is the highest cause of death for police officers. It's not even close to the number 2 cause. And yet we have grave concerns, and thus we have grave concerns about police officers who are feeling suicidal policing in our communities. That's not healthy for anybody. It's not healthy for them. It's not healthy for the community. And so we want a great deal more mental health screening and mental health resource availability for police officers. Availability is not good enough. We've got to find some systems for police to use mental health resources. And that's a challenge in and of itself, because you do have that warrior mentality and the huge stigma on using mental health services. I don't need it, I'm fine kind of thing. But then a person commits suicide, and we have had officers in Ann Arbor commit suicide. So it's not a theoretical sort of discussion. It's a real live one. And so we talk to mental health partners all the time. So we have informal partnerships with all kinds of agencies across Ann Arbor, because it takes a village. We can't sit around as 11 people and figure out what is good for policing. What's good for policing in Ann Arbor has to be a reflection of everybody in Ann Arbor, people who work in Ann Arbor, live in Ann Arbor, interact in Ann Arbor. And so we need a huge diversity of voices to contribute to what that picture looks like.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. It's certainly been a very thorough and informative discussion. And thank you, Peggy. I didn't have either of those questions on my chat for some reason. So I will now besides thanking you, Lisa, I'll turn this back over to Mary Jo.
Thank you, Marlene. And thank you again, Dr. Jackson, for a great presentation. I certainly learned a lot. I did want to refer people to the website that was mentioned. And there are 2 particular publications of note. One is the President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And then also from the organization that Dr. Jackson mentioned, National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, their handbook is downloadable. And the way I got to the website was, I just Googled Ann Arbor city government. I'm a former librarian. And so it brought me to this wonderful page that has this big, I think it was red button that says democracy. And so I clicked that and it gave me a list of the commissions. So I just thought that was kind of fun. I'd also like to thank you all the attendees who joined us tonight, and for your questions. That's how we learn more. And food for thought. And I also want to thank Peggy for also putting in many of the citations in chat, and Marlene for taking care of the meeting tonight. I want to remind you that this program will be on our YouTube channel, on our website. And if anyone is interested who's not a member in getting on our mailing list to receive a league news, go on our website and there's a sign up there. And any last thoughts, Dr. Jackson?
No, just thank you so much for having me. I'm always happy to talk about civilian oversight and what regular people can do to kind of make sure that policing reflects their values, because that's super important. And I think, you know, one day if all police departments have some form of civilian oversight that has some ability to change their behavior or to have an influence on it, I think that's really important. So thanks for letting me come and talk about it.
Well, thank you. And I hope everyone has a safe and happy Thanksgiving. Please stay home if you can. And good night and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll stop.
Want to turn the recording off?
Yes, I will. Sorry.